If you've been following along in the Make Your First Quilt Simple Rail Fence project, then you'll have your quilt top, your batting, and your backing. And today I'm going to show you how to sew all the layers together. Welcome to Epida Studio. I help you make beautiful things with quilting, bujagi, and embroidery. So if you've been following the Make Your First Quilt project, you've seen how to make the simple rail fence quilt, and we've made the quilt top. We've talked about batting, and we've talked about the backing that go in the back. And today we're going to be putting those layers together. Now there are multiple ways to do this. You can tie it, you can do free motion quilting, you can do ruler quilting, you can do hand quilting. I'm not talking about any of those methods. Those are all different methods that you can go look up and find more about. But I'm going to be talking about the method that I recommend for beginners for their first project if they want to quilt it on their home machine by themselves. This is what I recommend. And then once you try it, if you want to go on and do different techniques, then you're welcome to do that. But this is the easiest and most forgiving method. So I'm going to be using something called a walking foot. Now this is a foot that goes on your sewing machine, and it has feed dogs in the foot so that not only are the feed dogs on your machine pushing fabric through, but the foot is also pushing fabric through. And this helps when you have multiple layers to keep the layers together as it moves through your machine. It helps that the bottom layer of fabric doesn't get pushed kind of ahead of the top layer. So if you have a walking foot, now's the time to dig it out and use it. If you don't have one, it's not totally required. You can quilt without this, but it will make your life easier. And some people, when they first try a walking foot, then they also want to use it in a lot of different things. They find a lot of other applications. So if you're going to do a lot of quilting and sewing, a walking foot is definitely worth the investment. So we're going to be stitching just with lines going across the quilt. So we're not doing anything super fancy, but it does look really nice and it still looks really effective. Now, there are many different ways that you can stitch easily just with lines across the quilt. You can do straight lines, you can do wavy lines, you can do horizontal, you can do diagonal, you can do swirly lines, and I have a whole series on my website with different ways you can do simple quilting with lines. But the one I recommend for beginners is wavy vertical lines, and either vertical or horizontal. What I mean by that is lines that go kind of like with the grain of the fabric. So in this case, the lines are going to go this way. And I recommend wavy lines just because stitching a perfectly straight line can be difficult to do. But if you stitch a line that's a little bit wobbly and wavy and all your lines look like that, then it's no longer a mistake. Then it's a design feature. If all your lines are wobbly and wavy, then it will look great. If you have every line is straight and then one is wobbly and wavy, that'll stand out and it'll look like a mistake. So by doing them all that way on purpose, that will eliminate that problem. Now for our lines, we have a couple things to consider. For my batting that I used, the limit is I think 5 inches. So my lines have to be at least that close together. And so looking on the quilt, we want some reference points, and we can see that there are some lines already going across the quilt. We can see the seam line goes right across, and then these seam lines are also vertical lines. And so I'm going to use these as reference points or guides. Now just a note about this, if you wanted to stitch straight lines, there is a technique and it's stitching right in that seam. And that's actually called stitch in the ditch. And a lot of people recommend that for beginning quilters because they say just stitch in the ditch, it's easy. It is not easy. It looks like it should be easy, but it is actually pretty difficult to do, to stitch right in the seam line. And I have another whole video about that. almost went viral because it was so controversial, but it's my opinion about why you shouldn't stitch in the ditch. You can check that out if you're interested and find out some other people's opinions about that. But I don't recommend that you try to stitch a straight line right in that seam, because it seems like it should be easy, but it won't be easy and you'll get frustrated. But if we use this as a guide and we're stitching a wavy, wobbly line that goes back and forth across this line, then we're just using this line as a reference and we're stitching around it. That is an easy beginner technique. Now the next thing you also want to think about is what color thread do you want to stitch in? And we can see this quilt has 3 different colors of fabric, and no matter what color thread we choose, it's going to be visible on some of the fabrics. If I chose blue thread, it would kind of blend in here with the blue fabric, but when I get down here, it's going to stand out on the white and pink. And the same if I chose pink thread or I chose white thread, it's going to show up somewhere. So just realize that your stitching is going to show up, and to choose your thread color, get some threads and lay them out on your quilt and get an idea of what it's going to look like. You might choose to have another color of thread that really stands out and is bold, or you might want something that is more subtle and is not as noticeable. That's totally up to you. If you looked at this thread and you decided, I'm going to stitch it with a bright green thread, that would be fine. And you could get some fun effects with that, where the quilting will totally change the look of your project. And that's something that you'll learn from practice and experience. So don't be afraid to try something different. If you're not sure and you're nervous about color, then try and find something that blends as much as possible so that your stitching won't be the star of the show. So I'm going with a really light blue gray. So I think that'll blend with most of this. But again, it's personal choice, and it depends what color fabrics you use as to what color thread you want to use. So just before we start quilting, there are a couple of other things that are optional, but they might make your life easier. The first thing is these quilting gloves. So these are gloves that are sold in the quilt shop for quilting, and they just have a little bit of grip on the fingers so that when you're moving the fabric, it helps that you're not sliding, it helps grip the fabric. So quilting gloves are an option. But another choice that some people use is gardening gloves, or any type of gloves that has a little bit of grip on the fingertips. I've even heard of some people that like gardening gloves, but they find their hand gets too hot and sweaty, so they cut a couple of the fingers off so that there's more ventilation, and then only a couple fingers. But so you can try that, but something that will just help you grip the fabric. It gives a little bit of friction, whereas your hand, to get the friction, you have to be pressing harder. So it's easier on your fingers and your wrist if you have that. And then something else that is helpful is if you have an extension table for your machine. So a lot of machines come with this. It's a little piece that you can put in beside your sewing machine, and it just extends the flat section that comes out from the bed of your machine. It makes the bed larger. Alternatively, if you have a table that you can sink your machine in, so the machine sits in your table and the whole thing is flat. If your machine didn't come with one of these, there are generic brand ones that you can get, and you can use that with your machine. So that's something else. It is not required, but it can be helpful because it just gives you a bigger surface to work with. So here we are at the sewing machine, and I found this is the line that I'm going to start sewing at. Now I am sewing vertically, so I know I have on my quilt 5 blocks across. And so this is the 3rd block and this is the 4th block. So I'm going to start sewing right down this line. And so this is the part of the quilt that's off on the side. So this, I'm just kind of sticking it into the neck of the machine. If you have a really short area in there, you might want to roll it a little bit, but don't roll it too tightly. Leave it kind of loose because we want to be able to move it as we go. And so I'm just using this line as my guide line, this seam. So I'm going to start with putting my needle down and up. And then I'm going to pull the bottom thread up to the top, and that will just stop any knots from happening on the bottom of the quilt. And then I'll put my foot down. I'm on a stitch length that is a little bit bigger than what I would use for piecing, so I don't want my stitches to be too small. So on my machine, I'm at about a 3. So now I'm just going to start sewing. And as I sew, I'm going to like meander back and forth across this line. And as I stitch, I'm going to stop and move my hands down. As I'm stitching, anytime I have something that looks like a bubble or a pleat that's coming up, I will just try and smooth it away with my hands. So I'll smooth my hands out so that the fabric that is in front of the foot that's going to be going under the foot, it's going to stay flat and smooth. As you're stitching, you don't want to have the fabric hanging down and causing drag. So as much as possible, you want to kind of lift it up so that it's going down into your machine instead of your machine trying to pull it up. So as you stitch, you might want to stop every once in a while and just lift up the next section. So here is the first line done, and we can see it's a little bit wavy. It goes back and forth, so I'm not stitching in the ditch, and all my lines are going to look like that, so it's not going to look bad. But you want to start stitching in the middle of your quilt and work your way out. So my strategy, I started here, then I'm going to stitch this line, the next main seam line, then I'm going to turn the whole quilt around, and then I'm going to stitch the other side, and I'm going to start in the middle and work out. And the reason why I turn the whole quilt around is because then it's not as much that needs to go in the throat of your machine. You can see if I was trying to stitch this line, I would have a lot of quilt bunched up here. So I want to minimize that as much as possible. So I'm going to start by stitching the main lines in between the blocks, but then you'll remember I have to have lines closer together just because of the batting that I've used. I can't have only those lines because those are 9 inches apart, and my batting requires lines closer together. If yours does not, if 9 inches is fine for your batting, then you could just stitch that and be done. But I have to have another set of lines, and so I have a couple of choices of what I could do. I could stitch a line right down the middle of the blocks and use that one. But what I'm going to do, because I don't want to bother marking that line in the middle, is I'm going to use these lines. So I have 2 lines of stitching in the middle of the block. So I'm going to stitch down here, and then when I get to this block where I'm crossing over, I'm just going to eyeball it to get down to the next block because I'm doing a wavy line. So I think I can eyeball that pretty good. If I wasn't comfortable with just eyeballing straight across, then the easiest way to mark your quilt top is with a hair marker. And so I have another video you can check out how to mark your quilting lines. But for this quilt, I'm just going to eyeball it. So I'm going to do all my stitching lines and then I'll show you what it looks like. So here it is with the quilting lines all done. Now this is all the stitching that is required to hold the layers together, but if you want to add more lines just for decorative effect, you can go ahead and do that. You could add lines in between or horizontal lines or whatever you wanted, but those would just be for artistic benefit. It's not necessary for holding the layers together. So once you've done as much stitching as you need, then it's going to be time to put on the binding and then your quilt will be finished. So stay tuned for the next video about that. And for more quilting tutorials, patterns, and inspiration, you can check out my website, epidastudio.com.